It looks like it's just gone to 11:30, so why don't we go ahead and get started. My name is Eric Meyer. I'm the Dean of the School of Information at University of Texas at Austin. And I appreciate your coming today to talk about some work I did, actually not while I was at UT Austin. I've only been at UT Austin for 3 months now. So this is work that I did at Oxford University. I was at Oxford for 11 years as a professor and at the Oxford Internet Institute. And also this was done in coordination with the Oxford University Consulting Branch. I'm still a senior fellow at Oxford as an additional, but I spend all my time in Austin now. I only spend a little bit of time in Oxford these days. But if you want to talk about Oxford later on, I'm happy to chat. It's a great city. I lived there for many years and I love it. But I also now live in my new home of Oxford. So this work has been funded by ProQuest, and I'll talk a little bit about the origins of this work and what it came out of, because it grew out of some previous work. Looking at the value of newspapers and research, as the title suggests. It's a bit funny, because I've got this fan blowing up the back of my neck into my ears. So it sounds very noisy up here, but if I shout, just try to bear with me. So we're going to talk a little bit in this presentation about the scholarly impacts of newspapers, an overview of a study that I did, again funded by ProQuest. Talk about some of the key outcomes of that, look at a few comparative charts, and then have a little bit of summary, and then have time for discussion and questions from the audience at the end. We've got about 40 minutes this morning. Hopefully I'll talk for maybe 25 or 30, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So this project didn't just start last year with ProQuest saying, oh, who uses newspapers? It actually goes back a long way. So there's been a series of projects. I've got some citations on the slides at the end, and I'll upload the slides afterwards if you want a copy of them. That goes back to 2008 or so that I did with JISC in the UK, what used to be called the Joint Information Systems Committee, now it's just JISC. And we keep changing how many letters are capitalized in that. But JISC in the late 2000 to 2010 period was interested in the fact that they digitized a lot of scholarly resources, and they wanted to know whether there was value out of that. Could they measure the impact of having digitized those resources? And so that initial project, we looked at 5 different digitized resources. I won't recite them, but if you're interested, there's reports available about all that early work. And we created a toolkit at the time that was helping other people measure some of the impacts of their digital collections. And I use the word impacts with an S, because there's not just one impact. You can't just have a single measure. And that was one of the points of that early research, was to look at a lot of different quantitative and qualitative understandings of how resources are being used. That led on to some later research with JISC. Again, we looked at 10 resources a couple of years after that they had been involved in. And one of those resources, 2 of those resources actually in some of those early studies, were EBO. How many of you know EBO early? This book's online. And House of Commons Parliamentary papers. How many know that collection? So these are collections that are related to both ProQuest and JISC. I can go into details about that if anybody has questions, and they're interesting, complicated resources. But ProQuest and JISC had funded some research in 2015 to look at EBO and House of Commons Parliamentary papers that led on from some previous work that I've done with EBO. I've got a number of projects with EBO over the years, looking at the kinds of impacts that it's had. And this slide, I'll explain what these pictures mean in a minute, so don't stress about the fact that these look a bit confusing, because you've got a slide later on that explains what these say. But for now, suffice it to say that EBO, you've got this concentration of areas of specializations of topics that EBO is interesting to in Scopus data. House of Commons Parliamentary papers is a slightly different pattern. And in this work last year, or 2 years ago, that we reported here at the Charleston conference, we, as a baseline comparison, added in the New York Times to see how it compared to some of these more specialized scholarly resources. The New York Times is a more general resource, right? And we came up with that. That there's a much broader range of disciplines that appear to be using the New York Times as a resource. So this observation in that research led to the current project that we're talking about today, which was, well, what's actually going on in newspapers? And can we find evidence for how it's being used in different newspapers by looking at the scholarly citations out of a database? In this particular case, Scopus. You could have used Web of Science, or even Google Scholar if you were so motivated. So there's lots of different databases you can use. This one uses Scopus because it's one that I happen to like working with in terms of its data and metadata. So this work funded by ProQuest and just led to this current project, which was funded just by ProQuest. And our objective here was to go from that observation that newspapers, at least the New York Times, was being used across a bunch of scholarly disciplines, and to try and understand what was going on there. What are the trends? Can we understand anything interesting? And we picked 4 particular newspapers that we're reporting on today. The New York Times, which we'd already done some work on, but we expanded that considerably in this project. The Wall Street Journal, again, a national or international source of record for a different audience, we presume. The Washington Post, again, another national paper of record, and then a British paper, The Guardian. And a couple of interesting things came out differently about The Guardian that you'll see that we hadn't necessarily anticipated. So we use Scopus, and if you want to access the full study, the link is here. Again, these slides will be available at the end, but it's SSRN. You can just write down that number, and then you can search for that, or the title of the study. So we'd also, I'll mention, explored a few other newspapers that did have some interesting things coming out, but we didn't have the time or funding to expand those. So we looked at the Los Angeles Times, we looked at a couple of others. Some of those other papers had very specialist kind of audiences that I think would be worth exploring in the future, but we didn't have the time to look at it right now. So we stuck with these 4. So we'll talk about these outcomes as we go along, but talk about the fact that the use of newspapers in research appears to be growing, and I'll show you the evidence for that. For each of the ones we look at, there's some interesting patterns about the kinds of disciplines that are using it. Across the disciplines, each newspaper has distinctive patterns, so each newspaper is used slightly differently in the scholarly landscape. And then these newspaper titles have global reach, but the global reach takes a slightly different pattern depending on which newspaper you're looking at. So we'll talk about all of those over the next 20 minutes or so. And then this bottom line conclusion that newspapers seem to be an important resource for academic authors now, and it seems like it will continue or even grow into the future. So this is the first chart. So explaining this graph, so this looks at publications referencing newspapers. So total publications referencing newspaper sources by year of publication. So the year of publication of the article. So it's a scholarly article that somewhere in the list of references cites one of these newspapers. And there's, again, if you want to know exactly where we found those, there are details in the appendix of the report that says how we search for that. So reference the New York Times, The Guardian, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. And you can see one of the other added advantages of these particular papers is they're pretty searchable and specific. There's some newspapers you could choose that would be very difficult to disambiguate the false positives that came out of the data. These actually work pretty well. We did a lot of checking of whether we were getting false positives with the queries we used, and it wasn't the case. Small number certainly, but not a major number. Now, one of the caveats that we have to put in this is that this is not about the source of newspaper access. We didn't look at whether people were getting them through ProQuest or through the New York Times website or through Google or whatever, or through going to reading a print edition. We have no way of knowing that from people's citations. In their citations, they don't specify, and I read it here. They just cite the resource. So we can't answer that particular question. We looked at 1981 to 2016 in this particular graph, and you can see this marked growth in the number of scholarly articles that cite newspapers over that time period, from quite a small number actually in 1981 to now in the more recent years, peak of 14,320 scholarly articles in 2000, what's that my number, 13, 14, that cite the New York Times. That's a significant number of scholarly publications citing that newspaper resource. You can also see something that I am quite keen to figure out a way to test, which is this interesting little pattern here. The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, 2013 or thereabouts is when they started putting in paywalls, and you see this slight dip after the paywalls hit. The Guardian does not have a paywall, and actually grows after that period. So this reflects something we sort of know about scholarly behavior. People go for the free resources so they can get them, or at least free to them, whether it's free to their organization or not. They go to things that are free to them and freely accessible to them. But I think this really underscores the fact that, okay, academics are a tiny bit lazy, and so they look for an article and they see, oh, we have a paywall, I can only see the first 3 lines of it, but maybe I'll go find it someplace else. Guardian, they've got a copy of something similar, and I'll go cite the Guardian source rather than one that I either have to shell out of my own pocket or go through a lot of hassle to get access to, if I either don't know that my organization has Subscription is something that would get me access through a database, or just for whatever other reason I'm not able to discover the original source that I might have found. So this is a tentative conclusion I'm reaching, but I think it seems to match a pattern that I've observed in the real world and would be worth exploring more. It'd be quite interesting to look at maybe a series of newspapers that are open access versus a series of newspapers that went behind paywalls to see the difference between the usage statistics after the paywall is set up. The New York Times wanted to tell everybody still reads the New York Times after our paywall, it's all working great. But this would indicate at least a slightly different story about the use of the New York Times in scholarly work. So we're talking about pretty big numbers here. 172,000 scholarly articles over that period of time cited in the New York Times. Washington Post, 50,000, the other 50, 60,000. So that's a significant amount of scholarly research that's cited in newspapers. And I'm old enough now that I was an academic getting trained back in here in this low period when newspaper sources weren't really seen as the kind of thing you would generally cite in an academic article. But clearly, that's changed significantly. And one thing I should mention also is that this upward trend is, when you do any scientometric study like this, you're going to see some upward trend in this period because there's more journal articles being published. So almost every chart I can show you that on any topic would have some upward trend. But this upward trend goes beyond the sort of normal, what you might expect for just any topic upward trend. So it seems to be growing faster than just the growth of journal articles generally. We looked at the top 5 disciplines citing newspapers over the last 17 years, so 2000 to 2017, and a bit unsurprisingly, social sciences are right up there at the top, as one might expect. So there's 3.2 million publications in the social sciences in this particular data set that I used. 182,000 of them had some citation of a newspaper, of one of these 4 newspapers, not any newspaper, one of these 4 newspapers in their article reference list. So that's nearly 6% of all social science articles that we were looking at cite one of these 4 newspapers. Again, if you expand beyond that to other kinds of newspapers, you've got a significant number of people using newspapers as a source in their academic articles in the social sciences. Arts and humanities nearly as high. Economics, again, there's some interesting patterns of this with things like the Wall Street Journal, business management, accounting, psychology. There is considerably less use in, as one might expect, physics or chemistry. But it's not zero. There is still some use in some of these disciplines that you might expect wouldn't really use newspapers at all. There is still use of some of these newspapers and some of these other disciplines. Again, details of that are in the full report if you'd like to see those. So I need to explain these scatter graphs. I promised this on that earlier slide, what these mean. So this image, it's something I like using because once people understand it, I think it makes sense, but it's not obvious when you first glance at it. So this approach comes from a colleague of mine, Loet Lanesdorff, who's in the Netherlands. And what Loet and his colleagues did was they took basically all of the data in Scopus. This is the Scopus underlying image. They've also got this similar one for Web of Science that looks slightly different, but it's the same method. And they mapped over the last, from 1950-something to the current day, all of the journal citations. So which journals cite each other, right? And they put them next to each other by how close they are. So if 2 journals never cite each other, they're way far apart. If 2 journals cite each other a lot, they're close together. And those are the underlying gray dots. So you can think of the underlying gray dots as all of science, at least as represented in either the Scopus database or the Web of Science database. So this is everything that's ever been published by journal. And then what you can do is take any particular set of data out of one of those resources and overlay your topic onto all of science and see which parts of science are most interested in the resource that you're looking at. So here, we've got, what is this one? Well, we'll come back to the actual specific diagram. I think this is, I don't know what this is. So the colored dots represent the journals in this sample, and then the bigger the dot, the more articles in that particular journal that have cited the source, and that the colors are grouped together based on a community detection algorithm that basically groups like with like. So this is the New York Times. Again, you can see the New York Times goes right across the disciplines. I'll blow these up in a second, the Guardian, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, so you can see those closer and see some of the differences. But here, you've got a little bit of a general indication of the kinds of things that are in these different communities. So arts and Humanities and social sciences tend to be down here, business tends to be up there, some of the medical things tend to be over here. Up here is sort of computing and engineering and such. And so you can see that the New York Times is being used right across the disciplines. I mean, there's maybe a little bit up here in applied math that doesn't really cite the New York Times, but really right across all other areas of academic study, people are using the New York Times in some fashion. I can't tell you exactly how it's being used because I got hundreds of thousands of articles here. I didn't go read them all, but they are certainly being used right across different academic disciplines. So if we look at some of the general patterns to take out of these four, so New York Times goes right across the disciplines. There's a lot of uses down here in social sciences and humanities and some other areas. In The Guardian, we saw this interesting sort of spike of things related to medicine and health subject areas. There are a lot of people in the medical spaces that seem to be citing The Guardian as a primary resource, which, again, I can't tell you the exact reasons for that, but it's quite an interesting pattern that newspaper seems to be including coverage that's of interest to the health disciplines. Wall Street Journal, and this might not be surprising, but it's a validation of the fact that we're finding something real, because the Wall Street Journal is really covered heavily in business, econometrics, economy, that area that one might hope that the Wall Street Journal has a lot of journal study. Yes?
I know you may get to this because you're still in the midst of your talk, but did you record what years that people were using those citations?
So yeah, we got all that data.
If it's historical.
So we've got all that data. It's a little bit tricky to report it in a very sort of concrete way.
Right.
So we tried to do something that would better be able to detect whether it's older or newer. It's actually a harder task than one might imagine because of the complexity and the messed up nature of citations. So we don't really report that much in this particular study.
Right.
Instead, we're looking at basically a snapshot of various periods of time over the last 20 or so years.
Yeah, because I think about the Times and how important it was.
Exactly.
The other papers go back too.
So this is something that would be a
yeah.
future project that I've had in the back of my mind, is to be able to actually dig through that data and more, at a greater level of detailed granularity, look at the temporal patterns of the sources that are in the different articles. But again, that's a bigger complex project and we haven't yet had time or funding for.
Yeah, thanks.
And then the Washington Post, strong coverage in the social sciences and humanities. Particularly, there's a lot of stuff in politics and policy, again, sort of validating that we're finding something that passes the sniff test. The fact that the Washington Post has a lot of people in the politics and policy are citing it suggests to me that our method is working pretty well. I'll just give a little bit of a boost to Luke and his tools. Creating these things, once you've got the data, creating this visualization is actually quite easy. You can do it very quickly if you've got the right data ready to overlay on the journals. So you can make these yourself relatively simply. So there's a lot of data here. I'll blow up some of these in just a second so you can look at a few of them more closely. This is looking at distinctive patterns of use by newspaper title. So we will not spend any time on this right now, but I'm going to look at each one individually just briefly so you can see some of the different patterns of which journals are actually citing these most frequently. So a little overview of the New York Times. So there's really citations across disciplines. You can see them here. You can see some examples of some of the journals that seem to be particularly active in citing them. And to see that a little bit more clearly in a table form, so you can see the New York Times, 540 publications in the Journal of Business Ethics have cited the New York Times over this time period. And those papers have themselves been cited 12,815 times. So this is looking, this column, the citations per publication, is showing not just the fact that these papers are being cited, but the impact of those publications. So are people citing those publications, right? So this publication cites the New York Times, these publications cite that publication. So you can see that not only are these papers being cited heavily, but they're in relatively high impact ways. You know, they're being cited in articles that are themselves being cited. So it's not just like poor quality papers are citing the newspapers a lot, and then they themselves aren't being cited because nobody cares about their work. This is good quality work in some of the top journals one might expect. Journal of Business Ethics, PLOS One, American Behavioral Scientists. You know, these are some excellent journals with hundreds of times that they've had articles that have cited it in that time period. Also, I'll draw your attention to the bottom line here. So this is the total number of journals that have cited. So we got 10,000 different journals that have cited the New York Times over that 17-year time period. And that represents 78,000 different publications over that time period. That's a significant number of journals that are relying on, their authors are relying on the New York Times as a scholarly resource. You can see some of the others are a bit less, but they're still fairly impressive. This is the top institutions, and this is North America, this is non-North American, citing the New York Times. So you can see some of these are what you might expect. They're a bit geographic, right? Columbia, New York University, City University of New York, etc. Are citing the New York Times, but also right across the country and right across the world. So University of Texas at Austin down here at number 12, and University of Oxford up there at 29, but first in the world, non-North American. So both places I'm in are pretty much heavily using the New York Times. But you know, Australia, Europe, right across the world, people are using the New York Times. So it's not just that Northeast cities use the New York Times as a resource. Similarly for The Guardian, and I'll go through each of the next titles relatively quickly so I don't get bogged down in details, but you can see some of the journals that are citing, including Oncogene and NPG over the medical side. And the titles, PLOS One, Environment and Planning A with 98 publications, Urban Studies, Journal of Business Ethics. So there's lots of interesting things about world conflict, about media, about sociology and journalism. So there's an interesting mix of titles here that are finding The Guardian important. And again, 7,000 different journals have cited The Guardian over this time period. And that represents 28,000 individual publications in those 6,956 journals. So we're seeing a relatively consistent pattern. You know, Guardian a little bit less prominent than the New York Times, but still lots of interesting activity going on. And again, The Guardian has primarily, the top ranked ones are, as one might expect, British, you know, Oxford, London, Manchester, UCL, King's, and so on down the list. But that doesn't mean that it's not being used right around the world. Toronto, British Columbia, NYU, Columbia, which are remember high on the New York Times list, are also using The Guardian quite heavily. So you do see some of what you might expect, which is a degree of localization of use of newspapers because people are aware of the newspapers that they read. But you also see the usage spread more widely than that. It's not just strictly localized to people citing the papers that they happen to be picking up on their train on the way to work or however they read their newspapers, they're drinking their coffee. And then likewise, so the Wall Street Journal, citations across disciplines, business ethics, management science, business horizons, Washington Quarterly, accounting review, the kinds of things one would probably expect to see of the Wall Street Journal. But again, 6,300 different journals using the Wall Street Journal as at least a citation. That's represents 30,000 different publications. And again, not just limited to New York, but there is a certain geographic bias toward the top of the list. But then it's used. Here again, Texas at Austin is number 10 here, even though we're not very close to Wall Street. And then finally, with the Washington Post, we can see Washington Quarterly, Third World Quarterly, American Behavioral Scientist, etc. A lot of things about world affairs, politics, policy, diplomacy, those kind of things that are particularly well covered by the Washington Post. And again, a bit of a geographic bias toward Washington, University of Maryland, Georgetown. But we see some of the other top research universities using it widely as well. So I don't know how much the geographic bias is strictly because people read what's local, and some of it might just be that institutions that are heavily interested in politics are clustered pretty heavily around Washington, D.C. And so you start to see some of these geographic clusters reinforcing each other. There's not really any good way of teasing that out in the data that we're showing here today. And then, before I wrap up, we also looked at how researchers across the globe are citing newspapers. This is just a little bit of an overview. The more detailed data, again, is in the report. So the darker color is countries that publish in relatively high volume compared to their overall amount of publications that come out of that country, right? So we've got total number of publications in all of science. We've got what proportion of that country contributes to, and then are they high or low in their terms in their use of newspapers. So United States, Canada, UK, Germany, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, using newspapers more than one might expect just based on their amount of publications in the general body of work. Because otherwise, if you don't correct for this, yeah, the United States ends up big on everything because they publish the most work. But this is correcting for the fact of the overall size of publication, so it fixes that problem. And then low use. So this is places that are less likely than one might expect to use some of the newspapers we looked at. Now you can see there can be a language thing going on here. It's quite possible that these other countries are using newspapers that are written in languages that are more local to what they're writing in. But of course, remember, these are also English language publications we're looking at. So it's not just an issue of language in the sources. It's also about the kinds of resources people access. And I think it shows some of the potential in places that, has some use going on, but there might be some scope for growth in terms of their awareness of some of these resources. So, I've kept just the time. I've got a few minutes for questions, but I'll just wrap up here. So the key takeaways is that there are good evidence, I think, that we show here that academics are using newspapers in research and that use continues to grow in a significant pattern. That the scholarly journal articles citing newspapers really span across academic disciplines. It's not like it's limited to a few disciplines that just rely heavily on newspapers. If it was all just in journalism, okay, fine, yeah, who cares, right? Expect journalism to cite newspapers. But the fact that it's spread right across disciplines, I think, is the interesting story here. And that geography influences use, but that's really changing, and the global reach of these 4 titles that we particularly looked at seems to be growing. So in summary, the news resources are really important to academic authors and reviewers. Maybe not be the single most important resource. People tend to still cite other journals, but it's clearly a very important resource in the scholarly publishing landscape. This use of research is growing by discipline and by geography, and access to these is really essential for scholars publishing, and particularly in the subject disciplines and the journals that rely heavily on these. And if scholars don't have access, that will potentially either weaken the quality of their research or weaken their ability to make the points that they want to make by citing appropriate sources. So, related reports. So this is this current report. There's a nice summary that ProQuest put up about the work that you can go take a look at. Very pretty. I'll also point you to a book I wrote with my colleague Ralph Schroeder, Knowledge Machines, that summarizes some of these early studies as part of what it does. And also you can go back to some of these early studies, looking at early news books online at HCPP, work in detail about EBO, TCP, and then this is a summary of these 10 early projects that we looked at a number of years ago, if you want to take a look at that. So you can go back and refer to any of those. Again, I'll make these slides available. So I'll just wrap up by thanking ProQuest and thanking Mary Beth Parrott, who helped manage this project. She's no longer at ProQuest, but she was very helpful when I was doing the work. And to take any questions you might have, we've got about 10 minutes. If anybody's got any questions, I'm happy to entertain those. So thanks for your attention and questions you might have. Yes?
So it occurred to me, and you mentioned it in your 3rd bullet point right at the end, the issue of access being a big piece of it, both on the slide you showed of Turkey, the Russian Federation, the low users don't have access, but also in your trend line, you referred back to when you were doing your work in the 80s when, okay, you're going to go and find a microfilm reel and scroll through it versus digital options that you can go on. And obviously those the ones you used were heavily accessible digitally, probably earlier on than a lot of other papers. But yeah, interesting. Access driving a lot of it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Along with, yeah, there's more things being published, but you also have a lot more access to newspapers as a source.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think in my experience, so there was a period 15 years ago maybe that anything digital was seen as suspect, right? So I remember I was interviewing once an academic for one of these earlier projects, and we were talking about the use of digital resources. And they said, well, yeah, I do use digital resources all the time. So maybe 2005, 6, 7, somewhere there. But I kind of try to hide the fact that I do that because top scholars 25 years ago, they didn't do that. They went and got dusty in archives. And so I somehow feel fraudulent or an imposter if I use digital resources and do it easier than everybody else had it. So I try to hide that fact. And I saw the same thing we did this focus group with undergraduate students at Royal Holloway College a couple of years back, and we asked them about their use of digital resources. And of course, everything they accessed was digital. They barely went to physical resources. But then we said, well, how do you, does that show up in your papers and your bibliography and so forth? They said, well, to be honest, I look at my bibliography at the end, and if it's got too many URLs, I just go start deleting them because my professor won't think I did any real work if there's too much digital.
Yeah, they were all hard copies, really.
But that sense of the digital being suspect and not real work, I think has started to fade considerably the last few years, and I don't see that much anymore. But it has been a big issue for much longer than one might expect.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
I wonder if you'd speculate a little further on that, because I was also struck by the timeline and the fact that, and you mentioned laziness or when things have a paywall.
Yeah.
That they changed behavior. So can you talk a little bit about how access, easy access, has perhaps changed the norms of scholarship? Because this idea of citing a newspaper was probably not the norm.
No.
And so has the norm of scholarship changed with access?
I mean, my suspicion is, yes, it has started to change, that the range of things that people will cite has broadened. Certainly people are much more willing to cite, in my experience, the great literature, things that aren't necessarily in publication outlets. One of my colleagues at Oxford that I've done some other projects with has a hugely cited paper that the most cited version is this working paper that they published in 2013, the publication of record in Montreal about 2017. And so nobody goes and finds this 2017 version, everybody cites that 2013 working paper. And I think this is, the ready availability of things on the internet certainly influenced this. But also, I think our changing expectations and our changing behavior. We've all gotten a bit used to things like Scholar popping things up. And a lot of scholars are very careful about what resources they're using and how they're citing, whether they're citing the right version. But in my experience, a lot of people are a bit more lazy than that in terms of their sort of rigorous attention to the detail of those citations. I certainly see it. Again, this is anecdotal, but people citing my own work or work that I know well, and I know that they're not really citing the version that I would prefer they cite. Now, whose fault is that? I don't know. Maybe we should make the version more clear for them to cite. But I do think we do see a shifting nature of how people choose what to cite, and that that's becoming more diverse. And if you look at, I think you know Mike Caldwell, right, at Wolverhampton. So Mike does a lot of work in this space of different ways that people are citing different kinds of materials in their scholarly work. And I can definitely suggest people look at some of his interesting work about people citing PowerPoints, and people citing working papers, and people citing all kinds of interesting things that they wouldn't necessarily have cited not that many years ago.
But it hasn't seemed to influence the publishing behavior, because
No.
they're still publishing these in peer-reviewed traditional journals,
Right.
even though they're citing.
Yeah, so that there's definitely a gap there, I would say. Other questions?
Yeah, that makes me wonder. I'm the PI on one of the NEAP project for the University of Florida, and it makes me wonder, with the availability in the last 10 years of all those historic newspapers that have come out chronicling America, the change in citation to the historical papers over that period of time, just because they are accessible now,
Yeah.
and they never found it 10 years ago.
So that's the project we haven't gotten around to.
Yeah.
Again, when you're dealing with the quantity you are dealing with and the
Right.
sloppiness of the source data, it's not the easiest thing to pull out, because pulling out the fact that something cited in the New York Times is actually easier than pulling out the exact issue and volume and year that they cited in the New York Times, because it's such a mess in terms of its actual data, because the reference field is just a block of text. So we have to figure out better ways I have to figure out better ways of scanning through that data and pull out the things. It's not impossible, but it just requires a bit more time and resources than I've got at the moment.
Interesting.
Other questions or comments?
It's definitely very interesting. The accessibility issue. Years ago, I cataloged the huge periodical set, one of the early American periodical sets. And I go up to the microforms area in the library and said, Regina, stop cataloging these. I've been getting all these ILO because nobody knew about them before.
Yeah. I mean, I think discoverability is the other
Yes.
sort of side of this coin. We've seen lots of evidence that once things become more discoverable, both the digital versions and the physical versions get used more once they're more discoverable. There have been projects, I know JISC had a project a couple of years ago called discovery of digital resources and non-digital resources. And better ways to enhance discoverability, but that's definitely part of the issue. Again, anecdotally, I remember talking to the librarian at Christchurch College in Oxford. And they were commenting on the fact that once they digitized things and made the catalogs available online, they got far more physical visitors to their facility because people knew that they were there before they didn't.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, in the back corner.
Could it also be that newspapers are relatively more credible to all other sources of information out there now because there's an editorial process, a bit of credibility at risk from a publishing house?
So there's an, I don't know if I can answer that question directly, but I can point you to some interesting work that might help you think about it. So one of my former doctoral students, Heather Ford, she's now at the University of New South Wales, has just published a book called Fact Factories. And her work is about Wikipedia, what constitutes a fact in Wikipedia, which is slightly different than this, and how facts get constructed in Wikipedia. So what counts as a legitimate source? And there are certain newspapers that do count as legitimate sources and certain newspapers that don't. But actually that's a fluid situation because what part of her research was looking at things like the revolution, the Spring Revolution in Egypt, and how what was accepted as a credible fact for a period of time changed because there were no other sources and people were willing to accept other kinds. So Heather Ford, Fact Factories, talks a lot about what constitutes a credible source in the context of Wikipedia. And those debates, I think, might shed some light for you on this. And her work is really good. Not only was she my former doctoral student, I just really enjoy her work. She's a good writer and it's really interesting. Yes?
You mentioned that there are also factors of geography and language barriers, but in looking at some of the countries with low use, is there also a way to control for the presence of censorship in those countries? Because even if they speak the language, maybe they can't get to it.
So yes, are there ways to do it? Did we do that? No. So absolutely you could do that. And again, a bit tying into a previous question, I can point you to some of the work of people like Phil Howard, who is looking at, he's looking a lot about fake news and those kind of things. And one of the things they really look at is censorship in different countries and how that affects the spread of information and the spread of news. It doesn't get directly at your question, but it sort of gets at the same kind of issues of how censorship might affect this flow of information in different countries around the world. So I would recommend Phil Howard's work.
Thank you.
I think we're within 1 minute of being out of time. Are there any last pinch questions before I let you go?
Thank
No?
you.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you.